My name is Rebecca, and I am 34 years old. For most of my life, my family has seen me as the simple one, the one who lacked the ambition that fueled the rest of them. They were architects of a gleaming, sterile empire of high-end cafes, while I was merely the keeper of a memory, the proprietor of my late mother's small, traditional bakery. They pitied me, and in their pity they saw an opportunity. They never stopped trying to buy me out, to bulldoze the last piece of my mother I had left and replace it with another of their bland, soulless locations. Their latest ambition was a massive contract with the city's new international airport terminal, a deal that would catapult their brand into the national spotlight. They were so sure it was theirs. They were about to find out, in the most public way imaginable, that the airport authority had a very different idea of what our city had to offer. They were about to discover that the sole food vendor for that new terminal, the face of our city to the world, would be the very bakery they called worthless. Before I dive into the story of how my family's biggest moment of triumph turned into their most public humiliation, I want to welcome all of you here today. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt underestimated or counted out by the people who should have believed in you the most, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe, because this is a place for people who know that sometimes the quietest paths lead to the loudest victories. The scent of my life is yeast and sugar, cardamom and melting butter. It's the smell of my mother, Elena, a smell I have wrapped myself in like a blanket since she's been gone. Her bakery, Mama Elena's hearth, wasn't just a business, it was the living, breathing heart of our little neighborhood. It was where you got your bread for Sunday dinner, the cake for your child's first birthday, the cookies you took to a grieving friend. My mother knew everyone's story, and she baked it into everything she made. When she got sick, I left my community college program to help her. Not because she asked, but because the thought of that warmth fading from the world was more than I could bear. My siblings, Thomas and Catherine, were already gone, chasing bigger, shinier things. Thomas was in business school, honing the killer instinct he'd inherited from our father. Catherine was interning at a marketing firm, learning how to spin beige into gold. They saw the bakery as a relic, a monument to a life they were desperate to escape. I remember the last lucid conversation I had with my mother. She was frail, propped up on pillows in the small apartment above the bakery, the familiar scent of baking bread wafting up through the floorboards. Her hand, thin and cool, was wrapped around mine. "This place, Becca," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "It's more than flour and water. It's a promise. A promise that there's always a place you can come home to." She looked at me, her eyes clouded with illness but still so clear in their intent. "Don't let them turn it into something it's not. Don't let them make it cold." I promised her I wouldn't. It was the easiest promise I've ever made. A week later, she was gone. The funeral was a blur of black suits and hushed condolences. My father, Richard, stood like a statue, stoic and unreachable. He had loved my mother, I think, but he had never understood her contentment with a small life. He saw success in spreadsheets and expansion plans, not in the smiles of neighbors over a shared pastry. Thomas and Catherine flew in, performing their grief with practiced solemnity. But even then, in the sterile quiet of the funeral home, I saw the calculations in their eyes. During the reception, held in the function room of one of their first Sterling Brew cafes, I overheard them talking by the minimalist steel and glass bar. "The location is prime for redevelopment," Thomas said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He wasn't talking about a home filled with memories. He was talking about a parcel of land. "The whole neighborhood is gentrifying. In 5 years, this property value will triple." Catherine swirled the Chardonnay in her glass, her brow furrowed with concern, but not for me. "It's just an eyesore, Tommy. It's embarrassing. People know we're connected to it. It damages the Sterling brand to have this kitschy little bake shop associated with us." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. They were carving up my mother's legacy before the flowers on her casket had even had a chance to wilt. I slipped away, back to the empty apartment above the bakery, and cried. I cried for my mother, and I cried for the lonely fight I knew was ahead of me. That night, I inherited a bakery, but I also inherited a battle. A battle against my own family, who saw my mother's life's work not as a promise, but as a problem to be solved. The years that followed settled into a predictable, painful rhythm. I ran the bakery, pouring every ounce of my energy into keeping my mother's promise. I learned her recipes by heart, the muscle memory of kneading dough becoming my own. The bakery thrived in its own quiet way. It became a sanctuary for me and for the community. The old-timers still came for their rye bread, and new, younger families moved in, discovering the joy of a real, handmade croissant instead of a factory-sealed pastry from a supermarket. I wasn't getting rich, but the lights stayed on, and the bakery was filled with life and laughter. It was enough for me. It was never, ever enough for my family. The Sterling Brew empire, meanwhile, was metastasizing across the city. Thomas as CEO and Catherine as Chief Marketing Officer were the darlings of the business pages. Their cafes were monuments to modern minimalism. Poured concrete floors, uncomfortable Scandinavian-inspired furniture, and a menu of absurdly priced coffees with names that sounded more like science experiments. There was no soul in them, no warmth. They were places to be seen, not to be comfortable. And with every new location they opened, the pressure on me intensified. They saw Mama Elena's hearth as the one ugly blot on their otherwise pristine portfolio. Catherine's visits were the worst. She wouldn't call ahead. She'd just appear, usually in the middle of the morning rush, dressed in an impeccably tailored business suit that seemed to repel the flour-dusted air around her. She'd stand in the doorway, her lips pursed, her eyes scanning the cozy, mismatched furniture and the decades of scuffs on the hardwood floor, as if she were a health inspector cataloging violations. "Rebecca, darling," she'd say, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension that always made the hairs on my arms stand up. She'd pick up a menu, handwritten on a small chalkboard, and a faint, pitying smile would play on her lips. Still with the handwritten signs. "It's so quaint." The word quaint from her mouth was a four-letter word. It meant pathetic, outdated, and doomed. One Tuesday, she came in with a particular mission. The bakery was humming. The morning light was streaming through the large front window, illuminating the motes of flour dancing in the air. The bell above the door jingled, and the warm, happy chatter died for a second as everyone turned. It was Catherine, looking like she'd just stepped off a runway and onto a farm. She ignored the counter and glided over to me, where I was boxing up a dozen cannoli for Mrs. Gable, a sweet-faced widow who had been coming to the bakery since my mother first opened it. "Rebecca, we need to talk," she said, not even acknowledging the customer in front of me. I forced a smile. "Hi, Catherine. I'm a little busy right now." She waved a dismissive hand. "It'll only take a moment." She then proceeded to launch into a monologue, right there in front of everyone. "Tommy and I were just looking at the quarterly projections, and honestly, we're worried about you. This place, it's a financial black hole. You're working yourself to the bone for what? For pennies. We have a new offer for you. A very generous one. Enough for you to take a long vacation, go back to school, maybe find a real career." Mrs. Gable, bless her heart, bristled. "This young lady has a real career," she said, her voice firm. "She's the heart of this neighborhood." Catherine gave Mrs. Gable a look that could freeze fire. It was a brief, withering glance that said, "The adults are talking." She then pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Not of the beautiful pastries or the happy customers, but of a small crack in the ceiling plaster, of the worn-out linoleum behind the counter. "I'm just trying to help, Rebecca. We're family. And as family, it's our duty to stop you from sinking with this ship." Later that day, I saw her Instagram post. It was a picture of the cracked plaster, artfully filtered in black and white. The caption read, "Some things are beautiful because they don't last forever. Cherishing old memories, but excited for a future of progress and renewal. #family, #urban development, #progress. It was a dagger wrapped in corporate speak. The comments from her friends were brutal. "So brave of you to even go in there, Cat. Tear it down and build something beautiful." I felt a hot, helpless shame wash over me. She had taken my home, my mother's legacy, and turned it into a prop for her soulless brand narrative. I wanted to scream, but instead, I just went back to kneading the next day's dough, my tears salting the batch. The generous offer arrived a week later. It wasn't a phone call or a conversation. It was a full-blown ambush. My father called and invited me to dinner at his house. This was rare. Since my mother's death, our relationship had become strained and distant. He never outright criticized me, but his disappointment was a constant, heavy presence whenever we were in the same room. I thought foolishly that maybe he wanted to connect. Maybe he was finally ready to talk about Mom. I arrived at his large, sterile house in the suburbs, a house my mother had always found cold and unwelcoming. Thomas and his wife, a woman as polished and emotionless as their cafes, were there. So was Catherine. My stomach sank. This wasn't a family dinner. It was a board meeting. We sat through a tense, flavorless meal that their caterer had prepared. The small talk was excruciating. They talked about their new summer home, about a recent trip to Milan, about the soaring stock price of a tech company Thomas had invested in. They talked around me, over me, as if I were a child at the grown-ups' table. Finally, after the plates were cleared, Thomas steepled his fingers, a gesture he'd picked up from some CEO seminar, and got down to business. "Rebecca," he began, his voice smooth and predatory. "As Catherine mentioned, we are very concerned about your situation. The bakery is not a viable long-term enterprise. It's an emotional attachment, and I understand that. But emotions don't pay mortgages." He slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the polished mahogany table. It landed in front of me with a soft, final thud. "This is our final offer. We're prepared to give you $50,000 for the property. Cash. $50,000. For a building and a business in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood that was worth at least 10 times that." It wasn't an offer, it was an insult. It was a valuation of my life, my work, my mother's memory, and they had priced it at a fire sale discount. I stared at the folder, unable to open it. I could feel the weight of their 3 sets of eyes on me. My father was the one who broke the silence. "It's a good offer, Rebecca," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's enough for a fresh start. You're young. You shouldn't be tied down to that place. Your mother, she was a simple woman with simple dreams. You can be more than that." That was it. That was the line that broke something inside me. A simple woman with simple dreams. He said it as if it were a failing. My mother had built a world of warmth and community from scratch, and he called it simple. I looked at my father, at the deep lines of disappointment etched around his mouth, and I finally understood. He wasn't just disappointed in me. He had been disappointed in her, too. I pushed the folder back across the table. "No," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Don't be emotional, Rebecca. This is business." "No, it's not," I replied, finding a strength I didn't know I possessed. "It's my mother's legacy. It's my home. And it's not for sale." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "Thank you for dinner." I walked out of that house, leaving them sitting there in stunned silence, the insulting offer lying between them on the table. I drove back to the bakery, the city lights blurring through my tears. The anger and the hurt were afire in my chest. But for the first time, underneath it all, there was a tiny glowing ember of pride. I had said no. I had stood up for her. I had stood up for myself. I didn't know it then, but that night the war had truly begun. And the very thing they despised, my mother's simple legacy, was about to become my greatest weapon. The whispers about the airport contract started a few months later. It was the biggest news in the city's business community. The new international terminal was nearing completion, and the Port Authority was looking for a single, exclusive food and beverage partner. It was a golden ticket, a contract that would instantly transform a local brand into a national one, putting their name in front of millions of travelers a year. For my family, it was more than an opportunity, it was their destiny. Sterling Brew was the obvious frontrunner. They had the capital, the operational experience, and the sleek, generic appeal that usually wins these kinds of bids. Thomas and Catherine were insufferable. Every conversation was peppered with references to it. When we land the airport deal, Thomas would say, "Not if." Catherine was already designing the uniforms for the airport staff and storyboarding the commercials. They saw it as the final jewel in their crown, the ultimate validation of their vision. I heard about it constantly, a background hum of their impending triumph that made my little bakery feel even smaller and more insignificant. One afternoon, while I was icing a batch of lemon poppy seed muffins, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a link to a blog post, sent by a friend. I almost ignored it, but the title caught my eye. "The Last Real Bakery in a City of Clones." It was written by a local food blogger, a young woman who had apparently been a quiet customer for months. I clicked the link, my heart pounding. The article was a love letter. It was a love letter to the bakery, to my mother's memory, to the very idea of a place with soul. The writer, Chloe, wrote about the way the light hit the flour-dusted counter in the morning. She described the taste of our sourdough as a memory of a grandmother you never had. She contrasted the warmth and authenticity of Mama Elena's hearth with the cold, calculated perfection of the chain cafes that were scrubbing the city of its character. She wrote, "In a world rushing to become the same, places like this aren't just businesses. They are acts of rebellion. They are proof that a thing doesn't have to be scalable to be valuable." I read it 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Someone saw. Someone understood. The post was being shared wildly on social media. The comments were a flood of love and support, not just from my regulars, but from strangers all over the city who were tired of seeing their favorite local spots disappear. For a few days, the bakery was a minor local sensation. We had a line out the door. I felt a surge of validation that was so potent it almost made me dizzy. It was a brief, beautiful moment of feeling seen. I had no idea that someone very important was seeing it, too. A week later, an official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. It was from the City Port Authority. I opened it with trembling hands, assuming it was a tax notice or a new permit requirement. But it was a letter. A formal, personalized letter, signed by the Director of Concessions for the Airport Development Project, a woman named Margaret Albright. The letter referenced the blog post. It spoke of a new mandate from the Airport Authority Board to create a terminal experience that was a unique and authentic reflection of our city's culture. "We are no longer looking for the biggest bidder," she wrote, "but the best story. Your bakery, Mama Elena's Hearth, has come to our attention as a potential candidate that embodies the spirit of this new vision." The letter concluded with a formal invitation to submit a proposal for the international terminal contract. They had even waived the substantial application fee, a gesture, she wrote, to encourage truly local, independent businesses to participate. I sat down on a flour sack, the letter shaking in my hand. It felt like a prank. A joke. Me. Compete with Sterling Brew for the biggest contract in the city? It was absurd. I was a baker. I knew about proofing times and the price of butter, not about supply chain logistics, pro forma financial statements, and corporate bids. My first instinct was to throw the letter away. It was a fantasy. A beautiful, impossible dream that would only lead to more humiliation when I inevitably failed. I was about to fold it up and hide it away when the bell on the door jingled. It was Arthur Weinberg. Arthur had been my mother's accountant for 30 years. He was a small, neat man with a sharp mind and a kind heart, long retired but still as sharp as a tack. He'd been a rock for me after Mom died, helping me sort out the chaotic paperwork she'd left behind. He still came by once a week for a coffee and a bran muffin, mostly, I think, to check on me. He saw the letter in my hand and the look on my face. "Good news or bad news, kiddo?" he asked, his eyes twinkling behind his glasses. I handed him the letter, a hysterical little laugh escaping my lips. "The craziest news, Arthur. The absolute craziest." He read it slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to a slow, widening grin. He looked up at me, his eyes shining. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "Elena. She would have loved this." He handed the letter back to me. "So, when do we start?" "Start?" I stammered. "Arthur, this is insane. I can't do this. I don't know the first thing about this kind of thing. Look at what they're asking for. A 10-year operational plan. Scalable kitchen designs. A marketing and branding proposal." Arthur took off his glasses and polished them on his shirt. "Your mother didn't know the first thing about running a business when she started. She had a bag of flour, a good oven, and a belief that people deserved to eat good bread. The rest? She learned. And so will you." He tapped the letter with his finger. "This isn't about spreadsheets, Rebecca. That woman, Margaret Albright, she's not looking for another corporation. She's looking for what you have right here. She's looking for soul. The paperwork, we can handle that. I've been retired too long anyway. It's time I got my hands dirty." And so began the most terrifying and exhilarating 2 months of my life. Arthur became my unofficial campaign manager, setting up a makeshift office in the back room of the bakery. We worked day and night. He, with his old-school adding machine and legal pads, translated my passion into the language of business. We created financial projections that were ambitious but honest. We designed a concept for the airport location that wasn't a sterile replica of the bakery, but an evolution of it. A place that captured its warmth and spirit on a larger scale, using reclaimed wood, warm lighting, and a big open-concept kitchen, so travelers could see the bakers at work. The hardest part was the personal statement. Arthur insisted it had to be in my voice. I wrote and rewrote it a dozen times, trying to articulate what the bakery meant. I wrote about my mother. I wrote about her belief that food was love. I wrote about the promise I made to her. I poured all the pain, the love, and the defiance of the past few years onto those pages. When I finally read it aloud to Arthur, his eyes were wet. "That's it, kiddo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the bid." The day of the presentation to the selection committee arrived. I was a wreck. I had to present at the Port Authority headquarters, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that made me feel like an ant. As I waited in the polished, silent reception area, clutching my presentation folder, the elevator doors opened and out walked Thomas and Catherine. They stopped dead when they saw me. Their expressions cycled through a comical sequence of confusion, disbelief, and then a familiar, corrosive pity. "Rebecca," Catherine said, her voice a cocktail of amusement and disdain. "Are you lost? The public cafeteria is on the ground floor." "I'm here for a presentation," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Thomas let out a short, humorless laugh. He looked me up and down, my simple, slightly too big for me blazer, my nervous expression, and just shook his head slowly. "A presentation? For what? Did you bring them a basket of muffins, Becca?" His use of my childhood nickname was meant to wound, to shrink me back into the little sister he could easily dismiss. Catherine leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, whatever this is, it's sweet that you're trying. But this is the big leagues. You're way out of your depth. Why don't you just go home before you embarrass yourself?" The receptionist called my name. "The committee is ready for you, Ms. Rossi." I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly. The look on their faces as I walked towards the boardroom doors was the final insult I needed. It wasn't just pity anymore. It was mockery. They thought my presence there was a joke. In that moment, the terror that had been choking me transformed into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just doing this for my mother anymore. I wasn't just doing it for the bakery or for Arthur. I was doing it for me. I pushed open the heavy doors and walked in, leaving my brother and sister standing in the hallway, their smug, certain smiles already beginning to curdle at the edges. The final decision was to be announced at a press conference held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel. It was a major civic event. The mayor would be there, along with city council members, business leaders, and a horde of media. My family, of course, had a table at the very front, right next to the stage. Thomas was in his finest suit, looking every bit the victorious CEO. Catherine was radiant, pre-preening for the cameras she was certain would soon be focused on her. My father was seated between them, a look of quiet, paternal pride on his face. They were the picture of success, the city's chosen family. Arthur and I had seats in the very back, tucked away behind a large pillar. I felt completely out of place, a mouse that had wandered into a lion's den. I had received a standard formal invitation, the same one sent to hundreds of other local business figures. There was no hint, no indication of what was to come. For all I knew, I was here to watch my family's coronation. Arthur, however, was calm. He just sat there, a small, knowing smile on his face, and occasionally patted my hand. "Just breathe, kiddo," he'd murmur. "Just enjoy the show." From my vantage point, I could see my family clearly. At one point, Catherine spotted me. She leaned over and whispered something to Thomas. They both looked back at me, and Catherine gave me a little wave, the kind you give a child you feel sorry for. A sad, dismissive little flick of the wrist. It said everything. "Oh, you poor thing. You actually came to watch us win. How pathetic." I felt a familiar flush of shame, but then I looked at Arthur, and his calm confidence was like a shield. I took a deep breath and straightened my back. The lights dimmed. The mayor gave a speech full of predictable platitudes about progress and economic growth. Then he introduced the chair of the Port Authority, Margaret Albright. She was an elegant, no-nonsense woman in her late 60s with intelligent eyes and an air of unshakable authority. She walked to the podium and the room fell silent. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "We're here today to announce the future of the traveler experience at our new international terminal. When we began this selection process, we had a choice. We could have gone the easy route. We could have chosen a familiar name, a brand that represents a kind of standardized cookie-cutter excellence. We received many impressive proposals that fit that mold. I watched my brother Thomas. He was nodding slightly, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He leaned towards my father and whispered something. They were so sure she was talking about them. Catherine was already practicing her humble but thrilled expression. "But we decided to make a different choice," Ms. Albright continued, her voice gaining a passionate edge. "We asked ourselves, what is the first taste of our city we want to offer the world? Should it be something generic they can get in any airport, in any city? Or should it be something unique? Something with history, with character, with a soul?" The room was utterly still. This was not the standard corporate speak they had been expecting. We looked for a partner who could offer more than just food and drink. We were looking for a story of resilience, of community, of a legacy passed down through generations. We were looking for a business that is not just in the community, but is the heart of it. Ms. Albright paused and took a sip of water. She looked out over the audience, her eyes sweeping the room. One application in particular captured the imagination of the entire committee. It didn't come with a slick marketing video or a massive budget. It came with a story of a mother who built a place of warmth and welcome, and a daughter who promised to keep that warmth alive. My blood went cold. My heart started hammering against my ribs, so hard I thought everyone must be able to hear it. This couldn't be happening. I looked at my family's table. Thomas's confident nod had faltered. He was frowning now, a look of faint confusion on his face. Catherine's smile was frozen in place, looking brittle and unnatural. Ms. Albright leaned into the microphone, her voice ringing with conviction. We decided that the first thing a visitor to our city should experience is not the cold gleam of chrome, but the genuine warmth of a hearth. The board's decision was unanimous. The exclusive food and beverage partner for the new Port Authority International Terminal is a business that embodies everything we believe our city stands for. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the anticipation hang in the air for a perfect, agonizing second. Congratulations to Ms. Rebecca Rossi and Mama Elena's hearth. The name echoed through the vast ballroom. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. It was as if the world had stopped spinning. My mind went blank. I couldn't process the words. Then, Arthur let out a whoop of joy and threw his arm around my shoulder, shaking me. "You did it, kiddo. You did it." The silence was broken by a smattering of confused applause, which then swelled into a genuine, thunderous ovation as people processed the upset. The spotlights, which had been aimed at the front table, began to sweep the room, searching for me. They found me in the back, behind the pillar, and I was suddenly blinded by a brilliant white light. Through the glare, I could see my family. It was like watching a film in slow motion. Thomas's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw was literally hanging open. Catherine's face had crumpled. Her carefully constructed facade of smug superiority had shattered, replaced by a look of raw, ugly disbelief. She looked pale, almost sick. But it was my father's face that I will never forget. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking at me across the crowded room, through the blinding light. And the pity was gone. The disappointment was gone. In its place was a look of such profound, stupefied astonishment that it was as if he was seeing me for the very first time. The reporters, who had been clustered around my family's table like sharks, turned as one. They began surging towards the back of the room, a wave of cameras and microphones and shouted questions. Arthur helped me to my feet, my legs still trembling. As I stood there, bathed in the light, the applause washing over me, I felt a single, perfect tear trace a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or even joy. It was a tear of release. The weight I had been carrying for so long, the weight of their pity, their condescension, their utter lack of faith, had vanished. In that one stunning public moment, I was no longer the simple one. I was the one who had won. The minutes that followed the announcement were a chaotic whirlwind. I was engulfed by a sea of reporters, their camera flashes popping like fireworks, their questions a barrage of noise. "Ms. Rossi, how does it feel? Were you surprised? What does this mean for your bakery?" I was completely overwhelmed, but Arthur stayed by my side, a steadying presence in the storm. He fielded the more aggressive questions, guiding me, whispering encouragement. I managed to stammer out a few words about my mother, about honoring her legacy, about how grateful I was to the Port Authority for believing in a small local business. My voice shook, but it was my own. We finally managed to escape the ballroom through a side door, leaving the chaos behind. Arthur drove me back to the bakery. The whole way my phone, which I'd left on silent, was buzzing and lighting up nonstop. It was a frantic symphony of calls and texts from Thomas, from Catherine, from my father. I ignored every single one. When we arrived, the street was quiet, the bakery dark. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of cold ovens and residual sugar. I walked behind the counter, the same counter my mother had stood behind for 30 years, and ran my hand over its worn, flour-dusted surface. And then the dam broke. I leaned against the counter and sobbed. Not with sadness, but with a profound, bone-deep relief. The battle was over. The promise was kept. The next day, the real fallout began. My face was on the front page of the city newspaper. The story of the small, family bakery beating out the corporate giant was irresistible. My phone continued its relentless assault. Finally, unable to bear the buzzing any longer, I answered a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Thomas. His voice was completely different. The condescending, authoritative tone was gone, replaced by a strained, artificial bonhomie that was somehow even more repulsive. "Becca, I've been trying to reach you. Congratulations. We're all so incredibly proud." I said nothing. He plunged on, his words rushing out. "Listen, I've been thinking. This is a massive undertaking. You're going to need help with the operational side of things. The logistics, the supply chain, it's a beast. I was thinking this could be a fantastic opportunity for a synergy between our brands. Sterling Brew has the back-end infrastructure you need. We could partner. A joint venture. It's a win-win. A joint venture." He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't acknowledging the years of mockery and dismissiveness. He was trying to co-opt my victory, to absorb my success into his own empire after he had tried everything in his power to destroy it. The audacity of it was breathtaking. A strange calm settled over me. The new me, the one who had stood in that spotlight, found her voice. "Thank you for the offer, Thomas," I said, my tone cool and level. "But that won't be necessary. I'm hiring my own team." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "But, Rebecca, you don't understand the scale of this." "I'm a fast learner," I said, and I hung up the phone. It was the most powerful thing I had ever done. Catherine's attempt came via a long, rambling text message an hour later. It was a masterpiece of self-serving revisionist history. "Bex, OMG, I'm literally screaming. I always knew you had this in you. I know I was hard on you sometimes, but it was only because I wanted to push you to see your own potential. That rustic charm I always talked about? That's your brand identity. It's brilliant. We should totally do a collab, maybe a line of Sterling Brew coffees exclusively for Mama Elena's hearth. Call me. We'll brainstorm. Hugs and kisses." I read the message, and I didn't feel anger. I felt a deep, profound pity for her. Her entire world was built on image and branding, and she was trying to apply that flimsy framework to something real and solid. I deleted the message without replying. The final confrontation was with my father. He didn't call. He showed up. He walked into the bakery that afternoon, looking older and smaller than I had ever seen him. The place was busy with new customers who had read the news, but they parted to let him through. He stood before me, his eyes filled with a confusing mix of emotions. Regret, pride, bewilderment. "Rebecca," he said, his voice husky. I saw the paper. Your mother, she would have been." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I'm proud of you," he finally managed to say, the words sounding foreign and clumsy in his mouth. For a moment, the little girl in me, the one who had craved his approval for 3 decades, wanted to cry and hug him. But she was gone. I looked at him, the man who had called my mother's dreams simple, the man who had tried to convince me to sell her legacy for a pittance. "Thank you," I said politely, my voice devoid of the warmth he was so clearly hoping for. I didn't offer him more. I didn't absolve him of his years of disappointment. I just let his words hang in the air between us, an acknowledgement of a debt that could never truly be paid. He lingered for a moment as if hoping for something more, but I just turned to help the next customer. He eventually turned and walked out of the bakery, a stranger in the place my mother had built. The power had shifted. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their partnership. I didn't need their pride. I was finally completely free. 6 months later, I stood at the entrance of Mama Elena's hearth at the international terminal. It was the night of the grand opening, and the place was breathtaking. We had worked with a brilliant architect who understood the vision perfectly. The space was open and airy, designed to handle a massive flow of people, but it felt warm and intimate. The main counter was made from reclaimed wood from the original bakery's floorboards. A massive, beautifully lit photograph of my mother, laughing as she kneaded dough, dominated one wall. Her recipes were etched into the glass partitions. It was a perfect blend of the past and the future, a modern space with a deep and unshakable soul. The air smelled of fresh bread and brewing coffee. It smelled like home. The place was packed with travelers, airport staff, and well-wishers. Arthur was by my side, beaming like a proud father, looking dapper in a new suit I'd insisted on buying him. My new business manager, a sharp woman named Sarah whom Arthur had helped me hire, was handling the media with effortless grace. My head baker, a young man whose passion for his craft matched my own, was leading a team in the open kitchen, their movements a beautiful, efficient dance. Mrs. Gable was a guest of honor, sitting at a prime table, telling anyone who would listen stories about my mother. This was my team. This was my family. Across the bustling terminal, I saw them. My father, Thomas, and Catherine. They were standing near a sterile, generic newsstand, watching from a distance. They looked out of place like ghosts at a feast. They weren't invited, and they didn't dare approach. They just stood there watching the vibrant, successful scene, watching me as I laughed with the mayor and shook hands with the airport executives. In their eyes, I saw the full, devastating weight of their miscalculation. They had looked at a diamond and called it a rock. They had looked at a garden and seen only weeds. They had built an empire of glass and steel, but I had inherited the earth. They had vision, they always said, but they had never been able to see me. Looking back, I realized they gave me a strange and painful gift. Their constant dismissal, their relentless pressure, it forced me to define myself on my own terms. I had to dig deep into my mother's legacy, not just to preserve it, but to understand my own strength. They thought my world was small because it was centered around a single old building. They never understood that from that small, warm place, you could build something that could reach the entire world. My vision wasn't smaller than theirs, it was just focused on things they could never value: authenticity, community, and love. I didn't just win a contract. I won back my story. I've learned that your value is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. It is something you build yourself day by day, in the choices you make and the promises you keep. Sometimes, the people who underestimate you the most are the very ones who light the fire that fuels your greatest triumphs. They may think they are burying you, but they don't realize they are planting a seed. I would love to hear from you all in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated or had to fight to prove your worth to the people closest to you? Share your story below, because every single one deserves to be heard. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and please subscribe to the channel for more stories of strength and vindication. Sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it can make a world of difference. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. I hope it gives you strength, no matter what battles you may be facing. Remember that family is defined by love and respect, not just by blood. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can be is exactly what someone else told you was worthless.